The International Monetary Fund was originally created to work with member nations to implement international financial system and correct balance of payment maladjustments. By the early 1980s, however, it took a different course. Rather than helping governments avoid currency crisis, it has persistently pressured them to abandon the regulation of cross-border trade and financial flows, resulting in massive trade imbalances and reckless financial speculation. IMF sanctioned policies helped attract huge inflows of foreign money to what were called the emerging market economies of Asia and Latin America in the form of loans and speculative investment. As Walden, Bellow, and Martin Core have documented, the rapid buildup of foreign financial claims set the stage for the subsequent financial meltdown in Mexico in 1994, and in Asia, Russia, and Brazil from 1997 to 1998. This is why, when it became clear that the huge financial bubbles the inflows had created could not be sustained, and that claims against foreign exchange could not be covered, speculators were spooked and suddenly pulled out billions of dollars. Currencies and stock markets went into free fall. Millions of people fell back into poverty. Then the IMF stepped in with new loans to bail out the foreign banks and financiers involved, leaving it to the taxpayers of the devastated economies to pick up the bill once the loan payments came due. In many instances, at IMF insistence, uncollectible private debts were converted into public debt. Over the last 2 decades, structural adjustment programs were imposed by the IMF and the World Bank on close to 90 developing countries from Guyana to Ghana. The objective of these SAPs went beyond debt repayment or attainment of short-term macroeconomic stability, seeking nothing less than the dismantling of protectionism and other policies of government-assisted capitalism that their theorists judged to be the main obstacles to sustained growth and development. 2 decades after the first structural adjustment loan, the bank states that it has formally abandoned the entire program, replacing it with what it calls the Comprehensive Development Framework. This new paradigm, according to a statement by the group of 7 finance ministers and central bank governors, has the following elements: increased and more effective fiscal expenditures for poverty reduction, with better targeting of budgetary resources, especially on social priorities in basic education and health. Number 2, enhanced transparency, including monitoring and quality control over fiscal expenditures. Number 3, stronger country ownership of the reform and poverty reduction process and programs involving public participation. Number 4, stronger performance indicators that can be monitored for follow-through on poverty reduction. And number 5, assurance of macroeconomic stability and sustainability and reduction of barriers to access by the poor to the benefit of the growth. What brought about this shift in plans? Clearly, it was a spectacular failure that could no longer be denied at the pain of totally losing all credibility. With dozens of countries under adjustment for over a decade, even the World Bank had to acknowledge that it was hard to find a handful of success stories. In most cases, structural adjustment caused economies to fall into a hole wherein low investment, reduced social spending, reduced consumption, and low output interacted to create a vicious cycle of decline and stagnation rather than a virtuous circle of growth. Rising employment and rising investment, as originally envisaged by the World Bank and IMF theory. With much resistance from the bank's entrenched bureaucracy, President James Wolfensohn moved slowly to distance the bank from the hardline adjustment policies and even convinced some of his staff grudgingly to work with civil society groups to assess SAPs in the so-called Structural Adjustment Program Review Initiative, SAPRI. For the most part, however, the change in attitude did not translate into changes at the operational level because of the strong internalization of the structural adjustment approach among bank operatives. Although self-doubt began to engulf the World Bank, the IMF plowed confidently on. Lack of evidence of success was interpreted to mean simply that a government lacked the political will to push adjustment. Through the establishment of the Enhanced Structural Adjustment Facility, the IMF sought to fund countries over a longer period in order to institutionalize more fully the desired free market reforms. It was the Asian financial crisis that finally provoked the IMF to make some cosmetic changes. In 1997 to 1998, it moved with grand assurance into Thailand, Indonesia, and Korea with its classic formula of short-term fiscal and monetary policy, come structural reform in the direction of liberalization, deregulation, and privatization. This was the price it extracted from the government for financial rescue packages that would allow them to repay the massive debt incurred by their private sectors. Instead, a short-term crisis turned into a deep recession as governmental capacity to counteract the drop in private sector activity was destroyed by budgetary and monetary repression. If some recovery is now discernible in a few economies, it is widely recognized as coming in spite of rather than because of the IMF. For a world that had long been resentful of the IMF's arrogance, this was the last straw. In 1998 to 1999, criticism of the organization rose to a crescendo. Criticism went beyond the IMF's stubborn adherence to structural adjustment and its serving as a bailout mechanism for international finance capital to its being non-transparent and unaccountable. Its vulnerable position was exposed during an early 2000 debate in the US Congress over a G7 initiative to provide debt relief to 40 poor countries. Legislators depicted the IMF as the agency that had caused the debt crisis of the poor countries in the first place, and some called for its abolition within 3 years. Said Representative Maxine Waters, do we have to have the IMF involved at all? Because as we have painfully discovered, the way the IMF works causes children to starve. In the face of such criticism from legislators in the IMF's most powerful member, Clinton administration Treasury Secretary Larry Summers claimed that the IMF-centered process would be replaced by a new, more open and inclusive process that would involve multiple international organizations and give national policymakers and civil society groups a more central role. What did that mean? Was structural adjustment dead? And had the Bretton Woods institutions seen the light? The fact is, in the case of the IMF as well as that of the World Bank, jettisoning the paradigm of structural adjustment left them adrift with the rhetoric and broad goals of reducing poverty but without an innovative macroeconomic approach. Wolfensohn and his former chief economist Joseph Stiglitz talked about bringing together the macroeconomic and social aspects of development, but World Bank officials could not point to a larger strategy beyond increasing lending to health, population, nutrition, education, and social protection to 25% of its total lending. Most at sea are IMF economists, some of whom have openly admitted to NGO representatives that the new approach was limited to changing the name of the Enhanced Structural Adjustment Facility to the Poverty Reduction Facility, and that they were looking to the World Bank to provide leadership. It is not surprising that in such circumstances the old paradigm would reassert itself. For example, the IMF told the Thai government, already its most obedient pupil, to cut its fiscal deficit despite a very fragile recovery, and it pushed Indonesia to open its retail trade to foreign investors despite the consequences of higher unemployment. Similarly, technocrats of the Asian Development Bank made energy loans contingent on the Philippine government's accelerating the IMF-promoted privatization of the country's national power corporation, even though consumers were likely to end up paying more to the 7 private monopolies that will succeed the state enterprise. It's the same old approach of deregulation, privatization, and liberalization, but with safety nets, is the accurate description of one Filipino labor leader.